fake, poser, sellout, industrial plant, tourist. If you've spent any meaningful amount of time around heavy music, you've heard those words. Maybe you've even used them. And what's interesting is that none of those accusations are really about music. Nobody calls a guitarist a poser because they missed a note. Nobody calls a vocalist a sellout because they can't scream. Nobody calls a drummer fake because they struggle with a blast beat. Those accusations aren't about talent. They're about authenticity. They're about sincerity. They're about trust. Because for some reason, metal fans seem obsessed with authenticity. More than most other music communities. More than almost any other subcultures. More than most other groups in general. But why? Why do we care so much? And perhaps more importantly, is authenticity even a real thing? Or is it something we simply imagine when we see ourselves reflected in somebody else? Welcome back to Negative Frequencies. Last episode, we tackled a question that doesn't really have a clean answer. Can art be separated from the artist? Whether you agreed with my conclusions or completely disagreed with them, there was one idea that kept resurfacing throughout the discussion. Authenticity. The idea that who the artist is somehow matters. That sincerity matters. Credibility. Truth matters. And the more I thought about it after recording that episode, the more I realized something. We talk about authenticity constantly, but very rarely do we stop and ask what we actually mean by it. So today I want to talk about authenticity, why metal fans care about it, why we seem obsessed with it, and why I suspect authenticity might not be exactly what we think it is. Before we start acting like this is a uniquely metal phenomenon, let's be honest. Authenticity matters everywhere. It matters in punk. It matters in hip-hop. It matters in country, politics, business. It matters in everyday life. Nobody likes feeling manipulated. Nobody likes feeling lied to. Nobody likes discovering that something they believed was genuine turns out to be manufactured. That's a pretty universal human experience. But metal takes that instinct, the Spinal Tap route, and cranks it up to 11. For decades, metal fans have built entire identities around being able to detect what's real and what isn't. Entire arguments have erupted over it. Entire scenes have fractured over it. Entire careers have been defined by it. I think the reason goes much deeper than music. Let's talk about one of the most powerful insults in metal. Poser. Think about that word for a second. Not musician, not artist, not performer. Poser. Somebody pretending to be something that they're not. What's fascinating about that insult is that it has almost nothing to do with skill. You can be an incredible guitarist and still get called a poser. You can write amazing songs and still get called a poser. You can have millions of fans and still get called a poser. Because the accusation isn't about quality. The accusation is about sincerity. And it's essentially saying, I don't believe you. And that might be one of the most devastating criticisms a person can receive in the culture built around identity. Because once people stop believing you, it doesn't matter how talented you are. Then we arrive at another word that has haunted heavy music for decades, sellout. And unlike poser, this accusation often gets directed at artists who have already proven themselves, artists who already earned respect, who already built credibility, which makes it even more interesting. Because when fans call somebody a sellout, what they're really saying is, I think you've broken an agreement. That's the part nobody talks about. Fans feeling betrayed. And betrayal only exists when trust existed first. Think about that. How often bands get accused of selling out the moment they become successful or popular. Not because the music necessarily got worse. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the musicians simply became more successful. Sometimes they evolved. Sometimes they experimented. Sometimes they just grew up. Yet people react as though a personal betrayal occurred. Why? Because authenticity and trust are deeply connected. So far, we've talked about authenticity as if it's something metal fans simply inherited, but I think it's worth asking a bigger question. Why metal? Why does this genre seem so obsessed with authenticity compared to many others? Because let's be honest, metal isn't the only genre where people care about sincerity. Yet, metal fans often treat authenticity almost like a moral value, something sacred, something worth defending, something worth fighting over. Again, why? I think part of the answer lies in how metal developed. For most of its existence, metal wasn't the dominant culture. It wasn't the safe choice. It wasn't the popular choice. It wasn't the thing you listened to in order to fit in. In many places, listening to metal made you the odd person out, the outcast. It made you the weird kid, the outsider, the person whose interests didn't quite align with anyone else's. And when people gather around a shared experience of being outsiders, authenticity becomes incredibly important because trust becomes important. If the culture itself feels marginalized, then sincerity becomes a form of currency. People want to know who's genuinely invested. They want to know who's committed, who's there because they care. And over time, that instinct becomes part of the culture itself. It becomes tradition, expectation. It becomes identity. Which is why metal fans often react so strongly when they believe somebody is being dishonest. We're not just reacting to an individual. We're reacting to what they perceive as a violation of a core value. Whether that's fair or not is another discussion entirely. But I think it's one reason authenticity became so deeply embedded in heavy music culture. The more I've thought about this subject, the more I started to suspect that authenticity and hypocrisy are really the same conversation, just viewed from opposite directions. Think about it. When we call someone authentic, what are we really saying? We're saying their actions match their words. That's it. That's the entire idea. Their behavior aligns with what they claim to believe. Now let's look at hypocrisy. What is hypocrisy? Besides a phenomenal band, of course. It's the exact opposite. A disconnect between words and actions. A gap between stated values and actual behavior. And once I started looking or thinking about authenticity that way, a lot of things suddenly made sense because fans can forgive a lot. They can forgive bad albums. They can forgive mistakes. They can forgive experimentation. They can even forgive failure. What we struggle to forgive is contradiction, especially when that contradiction feels intentional, especially when it feels deceptive. Think about how often controversy erupts around bands that spend years promoting a particular image or philosophy only to later behave in ways that seem completely incompatible with it. Their outrage isn't usually "you changed." The outrage is "you told us one thing and did another." That's why hypocrisy feels so personal. It breaks trust. And trust is ultimately what this entire episode has been about. Not authenticity, trust. Authenticity is simply the evidence people use when deciding whether trust is deserved. Maybe that's why accusations of hypocrisy hit so much harder than accusations of incompetence. Nobody expects perfection, but most people do expect honesty. And this is where I think we've been using the wrong word the entire time. I don't think metal fans are actually looking for authenticity. I think they're looking for consistency. Think about it. Fans can handle change. Plenty of bands evolve, plenty of bands experiment, plenty of bands take risks. What fans struggle with is the feeling that they've been lied to. that the person they've been listening to wasn't who they claimed to be. That's what creates outrage. That's what creates resentment, accusations, because consistency creates trust, and trust creates loyalty. Now, let's make things even more complicated. Because authenticity was already difficult to measure before the internet. Today, it's nearly impossible. Once upon a time, scenes were local. They knew who was showing up. They knew who was supporting bands. They knew who was actually involved. Authenticity felt observable. Now, everything's filtered through algorithms, branding, marketing, social media, carefully curated personas. Nobody really knows anybody anymore, which creates an interesting problem. We crave authenticity more than ever, while simultaneously having fewer ways to verify it. Here's where I might lose some people, but I think it's worth considering. What if authenticity isn't actually something we discover? What if it's something we project? What if authenticity isn't a measurable trait? What if it's simply the feeling we get when somebody aligns with our expectations? Because I've noticed something. People often describe artists as authentic when they agree with them, when they relate to them, when they see themselves in them. But the moment those artists change, suddenly authenticity gets called into question. Maybe authenticity isn't objective at all. Maybe it's relational. And if that's true, that changes everything. At this point, you might be wondering, why does any of this matter? Because I think authenticity sits underneath almost every major argument in heavy music. It's underneath gatekeeping. It's underneath the genre wars. It's underneath accusations of selling out, underneath discussions about credibility, discussions about art itself. Authenticity may be one of the foundational values of metal culture, yet most of us have never stopped to examine what we actually mean when we use the word. The longer I think about it, the longer I think about authenticity, the less interested I become in defining it. And the more interested I become in understanding why we need it. Because maybe authenticity isn't really about musicians. Maybe it's about trust. Maybe it's about identity. Maybe it's about our desire to believe that some things are still genuine in a world increasingly filled with performance. Maybe that's why metal fans care so much. Not because we're uniquely obsessed with authenticity, but because we're uniquely sensitive to the feeling of losing it. Next time on Negative Frequencies, black metal has spent decades making people uncomfortable, but I don't think it's because of the reasons most people assume. I think black metal still bothers people because it represents something modern culture increasingly struggles to tolerate. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next time. Until then, thanks for hanging out.